Today, we have a very special guest from the University of Delaware, Dr. Doug Tallamy, who will share information with you on Homegrown National Park. He has been studying insects since the 1970s, or maybe even prior, has authored approximately 100 research publications, and taught insect-related courses for over 50 years. He has won numerous awards and is noted as one of the biggest proponents of native plants. Dr. Tallamy is the author of the best-selling gardening and horticultural books, Bringing Nature Home, Nature's Best Hope, and The Nature of Oaks. He was featured in Smithsonian's Magazine's article in April 2020, Meet the Ecologist Who Wants You to Unleash the Wild on Your Backyard. Please stay tuned as Dr. Tallamy shares his vision for converting 20 million acres of America into a homegrown national park and providing hope for our future. If you're excited to hear tonight's presentation, please use the reaction button at the bottom of your screen to give a warm welcome to Dr. Doug Tallamy.
Well, thank you, Catherine. All right. Can y'all see that now?
Yes, sir. We are good.
All right, good. Thank you for that introduction. I've just discovered there is a mosquito in my room. So if I start slapping my head in the middle of this, that's why. Okay, Homegrown National Park, building networks for life. I'm going to tell you how that came about and what it's all about. But before we do that, let's look at this creature. Kind of looks like a bird's fecal sac. When birds nest, they don't want their babies to poop in the nest. So the babies create this little fecal sac and the parents pick it up and fly away and drop it. And it kind of looks like that when it splats on a leaf. But that's actually a spider. It's called a bola spider. There are the legs all curled up. And at night, it really looks like a spider. It hangs down and it doesn't hunt with the web. It hunts with a single strand of silk with one sticky glob of glue at the end. And moths come in and get stuck on that glob of glue and they quickly wrap them up and then they feed on them. They get a good meal. And they do that over and over again. And when they get enough energy, they create an egg mass. So this is a silken container, and inside is all of the eggs of the spider. And if she feeds very successfully, she'll make 2 or 3 egg masses before the end of the summer. And that's how these guys overwinter. Now you might wonder, why a moth is flying into a single target like that. Seems like that's not a great way to hunt, but it's not an accident. She's releasing the sex pheromone of particular species of moths. So all the moths she catches are males. And I was curious about which species she was, the bola spider in my yard was attracting. So I unwound all of those bodies and took a look at it. And it turns out it's the bronze cutworm. And I have bronze cutworms, adults, because I've got bronze cutworm larvae, and I've got bronze cutworm larvae because I've got the host plants that they eat, primarily goldenrod. I also have this beautiful moth, the dot-lined white, because I've got oak trees, specifically white oaks, and because I don't rake their leaves away. There is a dot-lined white cocoon in this bunch of leaves here, and there's no way you would see that when you're raking. There it is right there. There it is in large. It's just this white thing at the end of a leaf. So when we rake away our leaves, we're raking away a very valuable resource on our property. I've got evening primrose moths because I planted evening primrose. The moths come, they spend the day with their heads stuffed in the flowers. And sometimes it's very, very crowded in there, but it's always very cute. I've got zebra swallowtails. They're the prettiest swallowtail around here. My favorite, because I planted pawpaw. That is the only host plant for that beautiful swallowtail. As a matter of fact, I've got a lot of things on my property. It would take me a long time, at least a week, to describe all of the species that now call our property home. It would not take me very long to describe what's happening on a typical suburban lot like this. There is no goldenrod, so there are no bronze cutworms, so there are no bola spiders. There's no oaks, so there's no dot-lined whites. There's no evening primrose, so there's no evening primrose moth. There's no pawpaws, so there's no zebra swallowtail. There is very little that can survive in a typical landscape. And we've got 135 million acres of typical residential landscapes in the US. That's one of the reasons that we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here, talking about global insect decline. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. It's a third of our North American bird population already gone. 2/3 of Earth's wildlife is already gone. 1 million species now are predicted to go extinct by the UN in the next 20 years. 40% of the Earth's plants face extinction. It's a whole bunch of really bad news. And that's why Elizabeth Kolbert gets to write this book, The Sixth Great Extinction Event That Has Ever Occurred on Planet Earth. It's occurring right now. Well, people are reacting to this. They're upset about it. And so much so that people are actually studying our reactions to the loss of biodiversity. And Richard Hobbs is one of those people. And he likens our reaction to the 5 stages of grief. So if we hear we have a terminal disease, we typically go through these 5 stages. First, there's denial. There's certainly a lot of denial out there that we have a problem at all. Anger. I feel that a little bit sometimes. Bargaining, well, how can we make it better? Maybe it's not so bad. Depression, we've got to fight that all the time. Then the 5th stage is acceptance. And this is where I'm going to fight back. Acceptance is equivalent to giving up. And giving up's not an option, folks, because nature is not optional. We all depend on functional natural systems. So I'm going to propose a 6th action or a 6th stage, and that is action. We really can turn these terrible statistics around. Now, we do have parks, we got preserves. Our national parks in particular were established primarily to preserve exquisite scenery. That was Teddy Roosevelt's motivation for expanding the national park system. And he described it this way: the establishment of the National Park Service is justified by considerations of good administration. So Teddy was patting himself on the back, as he should have, of the value of natural beauty as a national asset, and of the effectiveness of outdoor life and recreation in the production of good citizenship. In other words, our parks were created because they were pretty places for us to play in. They were not created with conservation in mind. And that's one of the reasons we only have 3.6% of the US in the national park system. Only 12% is federally protected at all, which leaves 88% unprotected by federal laws. And what's happening in those unprotected areas is appalling. Every 30 seconds, a football field worth of America's natural areas disappears to development, which happens to be the most oxymoronic word in all of conservation. Got 44 million acres of lawn. That's the latest statistic I've seen. That's an area bigger than the size of New England. We've paved over an area larger than Ohio. And that statistic is at least 15 years old. So you know it's bigger than that. We got 2 million acres of golf courses. That's an area larger than Rhode Island and Delaware combined, dedicated to golf. Well, we do have parks and we do have preserves, and people wonder why they are not enough to sustain biodiversity, to sustain the amount of biodiversity that we need. And there are several reasons why they're not enough, but the biggest one is that they're too small. When you take a large area like this and you shrink it down into a little habitat fragment, and that's somewhat of an exaggeration, but they are considerably smaller than what they started with. What you're doing is taking large populations and shrinking them down to small or tiny populations. And that is the problem. Small populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why? Because all populations fluctuate. Good times, they go up. Bad times, they go down. But if you're a large population, this top line here, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals so you can increase quickly when times get better. But if you're a small population, those normal fluctuations, you often hit zero. You blink out of your little habitat fragment, and then you're gone. And unless you recolonize that fragment, and picture a box turtle crossing a major highway, doesn't happen, then you're permanently gone. That's called local extinction. And there's studies all over the planet, some of them quite long, 100 years in length, telling us the same thing. The natural areas we have left are not large enough to sustain the amount of nature that we need, because it is nature that sustains us. There is a steady drain of species from these isolated parks and preserves. Now, we tend to talk about extinction all the time, and extinction is our metric of trouble. I don't like that, because that's like going to the doctor when you're already dead. I think a more accurate measure of a problem is the decline of species that were once abundant. This is the American chestnut, used to be the dominant tree from Maine all the way to Georgia, along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. They're not extinct, but they're functionally extinct. They were wiped out by the chestnut blight, and all we have are little sprouts here and there. Rusty patch bumblebee used to be one of the most common bumblebees on the continent not long ago, 10, 15 years ago. Now, if you see a rusty patch bumblebee, you want to report it because they are so rare. So they're functionally extinct again. Beavers. Now, beavers are not extinct, and they're actually coming back in some areas, but they created and managed the hydrology of the entire continent before Europeans came and essentially trapped them all out. So when we remove beavers from ecosystems, we changed the hydrology, and in many cases, we changed it very much for the worse. So rather than extinction, we're talking about defaunation, the reduction in abundance of species that were once very common. That is the real problem. It's local. Think about the number of creatures that live right where you live. It's just a shadow, probably just a shadow of what it used to be. So it's local, it's everywhere. And in many cases, we don't even notice the reduction in abundance. That's because of something called shifting baseline. We tend to think that things are right if they are the way they were when we were growing up. So in other words, if we're born into a world that has no, very few birds and no beavers and anything else, we think that's normal because it's all we ever experienced. None of us missed the passenger pigeon because none of us were alive when it was here. It used to be the most common bird on the planet, and now it's gone. So shifting baseline means that we're losing biodiversity, the biodiversity that sustains us, and we're not even noticing it. So what should we do? Well, the UN's on board now. They had the big meeting in Montreal last year to talk about the biodiversity crisis. So recognizing it is really important. What does the UN do? It makes resolutions. This is a headline from that meeting. Crucial negotiations to protect biodiversity are moving at a snail's pace. We are negotiating whether or not we're going to protect what keeps us alive on this planet. So looking forward to those resolutions, but I don't know if it's going to be the thing that actually saves us. E.O. Wilson, of course, fought to save biodiversity during his entire very long career at Harvard. And one thing that was consistent throughout that career was that he loved life on Earth. He loved biodiversity. And in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we have to save nature. We have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or we're going to lose life everywhere. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. But then he ended the book. He did not spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. So a lot of people are wondering, how can we possibly do this? The problem is half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. And I do not see us getting rid of that real soon. And we got 8 billion people in the other half, along with all of our hardscape, our detritus, our roads, our airports. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we do this? Well, I think we can. I think we can do it, believe it or not. And that's basically what I want to talk about. It's the reason that we came up with Homegrown National Park. But in order to realize E.O. Wilson's dream, we need a new approach to conservation. We've got to give up the idea that humans and nature cannot coexist. We got one planet. We all have to be here on the planet at the same time, in the same place at the same time. And that's a new notion for humans. And I'm going to argue that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and save nature where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. So we're not just going to save nature here. We're going to save it over here too. And look, it's already gone. That means we've got to restore it. And that means we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. So here's the problem. Fragmentation. We do have viable habitats out there, but they're small, they're isolated, and there's not very many of them. So this is called fragmentation. And what has been proposed is that we connect these habitat fragments with biological corridors that will allow plants and animals to move back and forth between these viable fragments. And, that is a good step one, but I don't think it's enough. As a matter of fact, I know it's not enough because the viable fragments are still small. the populations within them will still be small. So when they fluctuate, they still have the high probability of disappearing. So what we need to do is build viable habitat between these habitat fragments and make them unfragmented. We got to expand the area in which our plants and animals can live. So this is a better model, and this is an even better model. The lighter areas here would be our cities and our agriculture, where there's less of ecosystem function, but we can put it back in an awful lot of areas where we humans now dominate. To achieve this, though, well, all of this area is private property. So that's an issue, because we've got property rights. How are we going to convince people to do this on their private property? We all have this, well, I don't know, but we all do, but most of us have this idea that we can do whatever we want with this piece of the earth that we own. The problem with that is that our properties are not like Las Vegas. You know that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, but what happens in your yard does not stay in your yard. That's the problem. Whatever you do in your yard does impact the greater ecosystem around you, whether you like it or not. Let's give you some examples, starting with the lawn. The amount of lawn you have is going to determine lots of things. It's going to determine whether rain infiltrates when it falls, or whether it leaves a stormwater runoff. It's going to determine how much nitrogen and phosphorus and herbicides and insecticides you are adding to your local watershed. How much lawn you have is going to determine how much carbon you are adding to the atmosphere every time you mow it, which is often once a week, once every 2 weeks. It's going to determine whether you're supporting pollinators or not, or whether you're eliminating the resources that they need. How you landscape your property is also going to determine how much carbon you are pulling out of the atmosphere, locking it up in plant tissues, and then pumping it into the soil for long-term storage. That all comes from the plants you choose on your property. Your plant choices are also going to determine whether you're harboring invasive species like Bradford pear here, ecological tumors that escape our yards and biologically pollute all of the land around us. So plant choice is actually going to determine whether we're supporting a viable food web in our yard, whether we're choosing the plants that produce the insects that feed the birds and everything else or not. In short, how we landscape is going to determine how much life Earth can sustain. And that is an awesome responsibility. And it's an awesome responsibility that homeowners, that landscape managers don't know they have. But it also creates a grassroots solution to the biodiversity crisis, or at least to much of the biodiversity crisis. Most of the land is privately owned by private citizens, a lot of them, millions of them. 78% of the country is privately owned. 85.6% of the country east of the Mississippi, privately owned. So that makes private landowners, property owners, the hope and the future of conservation. Whether or not they practice conservation on their private properties is going to make the difference. So I always talk about lawn. Lawn is the low-hanging fruit out there. And again, we've got more than 44 million acres of lawn in this country. And you know why we do it. Lawn is a status symbol. And we also need to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we cut that area in half? Let's say we got 40 million acres. Let's cut it in half. That'll give us 20 million acres. And that is the land that we're going to start building Homegrown National Park from. We're going to restore 20 million acres right where we live. And that's going to be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badland National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park is going to be the biggest park in the country. Well, I had this idea when I heard about that figure of 40 million acres of lawn, which is probably 2006, somewhere around there. I started putting it in my talks, but I didn't actually write about it until I wrote Nature's Best Hope and made it a chapter called Homegrown National Park. But it wasn't until I met a woman, Michelle Alfandari, who came to one of my talks. She was a member of what we call the non-choir. So people say you only talk to the choir. You say, well, it's only the choir who invites me. Well, Michelle, she just retired from a licensing career in Manhattan, and had moved to Connecticut. And she was only there a short while when her neighbor said, I want you to come to a talk that this guy's giving. So she dragged Michelle there, and that guy was me. She listened to the talk, and she came up to me afterwards and she said, you're not hitting your target audience. Your target audience is all the people like me who don't know anything about this. I said, yeah. I said, well, I don't know how to do that. She said, you need social media. You need, to reach out with all modern forms of communication to reach those people that don't know all about this. And I said, I don't do that. And she said, I do that. So let's make a small nonprofit that we'll call Homegrown National Park.org. And we did. It's a little bit more than 2 years old now. The object is to register your property on the map, where you are and the amount of area on your property that you're going to start to be a good steward of. If you really are going to cut the area of lawn in half, great. That area goes on the map. Maybe you're going to plant an oak. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. It doesn't matter how small an area you're going to start to take care of, but that area gets listed on the map, and your little piece of your county lights up. And you get to see who else in your county has joined Homegrown National Park. It's free, by the way. We want a lot of people. The object is to get the entire country to light up. So this is where the national parks are right now. We want to turn it into this. And if we do that, biodiversity crisis is not going to be so large anymore. What are we asking? We are asking people to reduce the area of lawn. Lawn does not accomplish any of the goals that we need to, the ecological goals that every landscape needs to accomplish. We're going to replace some of that lawn with the native plants that do accomplish those goals. We're going to remove invasive plants. Most residential landscapes do have invasive plants on them, and most people don't even know it. If you're already protecting a natural area, you certainly want to keep doing that. There are real ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park, a significant increase in biodiversity. And I'll give you some examples of how easy that actually is. A measurable reduction in invasive species. 78% is privately owned, 85% east of the Mississippi. If everybody got rid of the invasives on their private property, we'd be 85% done in the east and 78% done overall. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the worst plant in terms of capturing carbon and storing it. So if you replace it with just about anything else, you're going to capture a lot more carbon, which means you're going to fight climate change at the same time you're helping the biodiversity crisis. And you're going to start to build viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. And every bit of conservation we do outside of a park helps conservation inside of a park. There are important sociological products that will go right along with joining Homegrown National Park. National awareness, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We really are trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's not just there to entertain us. And everybody owns a responsibility to sustaining it because everybody needs it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action is better. And we want to merge all the existing national conservation efforts, Audubon and National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones, all of the people in the native plant societies across the country, land conservancies. They're doing great conservation on private property. And because we don't charge, we're not pulling membership away from any other organization, but we get to see, if people join on the map, we get to see how much conservation is happening in private property. This will contribute to the national, actually the global effort that we call 30 by 30. We're going to save 30% of the earth by 2030 or 30% of the US by 2030. It's not going to happen unless we measure conservation on private property. There's urgency to enacting the Homegrown National Park solution. We do have 135 million acres of residential landscape. That is a big job, so we all need to get to work. We can do it. I'm convinced we can do it, but there are a few things that we need to learn if we're going to succeed. It's got to become common knowledge what those ecological goals of every landscape are. Every landscape has to support food webs. Every landscape has to sequester carbon, has to capture carbon, pull it out of the atmosphere, put it in the tissue of plants, and then pump it into the ground. Every landscape has to manage the watershed in which it lies, and every landscape has to support pollinators. We all can look at our landscapes and say, how can we do each one of these better? Lawn accomplishes none of those. So that's why we focus on reducing the area of lawn. It doesn't accomplish any of those 4 primary goals. Plant choice is what it's all about. We've got to accept that plant choice matters. If we choose non-native plants this is burning bush, highly invasive, not only is it not supporting biodiversity, but it's escaping and wrecking our natural areas. There are 3 kinds of plants out there. There are plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that remove energy from local food webs. Oaks are they are the best contributors around the country. In 84% of the counties in which oaks occur, they are contributing more energy to local food webs than any other plant genus, by far. A great example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo biloba, or any of the other plants from Asia. It's a nice ornamental plant. It's not invasive, but nothing eats a ginkgo. So it's there, but it's not contributing any energy to local food webs. And a good example of a detractor would be, this is bamboo, but, showed you a picture of calorie pear, any of the invasive ornamentals that escape our yards and push out the native plants that are good contributors and replace them with these plants that are very poor contributors. That's removing energy from local food webs. We need to appreciate how important caterpillars are in local food webs. And I talk a lot about caterpillars because caterpillars are really important. They're transferring more energy from plants to animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. And this is why the concept of keystone plants is so important, because they are the plants that are making most of the caterpillars. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the arch, the Roman arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building outside as the 2x4s that support that house. They are the support system. You can't build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do with our ornamental plants for I don't know, 100 years anyway. What is the best keystone plant where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the best woody plant genera and herbaceous plant genera will pop up for your county. This is really accurate for most areas of the country. But I will admit, as you get down right into the Rio Grande Valley, it starts to fall apart a little bit. Lower Florida falls apart. But for most of the area, most of Texas, it is a very good resource. We also have to listen to what E.O. Wilson told us. He told us insects are the little things that run the world. And that's a big deal because we're losing our insects. And we've got to understand what keeps insects around. The insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. 90% of them can only eat particular plants. So they're only going to support local food webs if we have those plants available. They can only eat the plants with which they have a long period of evolutionary history so they can build up the adaptations necessary to be able to exploit those plants. All plants are protecting themselves with nasty chemicals, and that's what host plant specialization does. It allows the insects to get around those chemical defenses. The monarch butterfly is a great example because everybody knows what a monarch is, and everybody knows that it's a specialist on milkweed. And most people know that milkweed is a toxic plant. It's filled with cardiac glycosides, which if we eat a lot of milkweed will stop our heart, and sticky latex sap that gives it its common name. When that sap is exposed to air, it gels, and if a caterpillar is eating the plant, it glues its mouth part shut. Well, monarchs can eat milkweeds because they've got the adaptations, the physiological adaptations to get around the cardiac glycosides, and the behavioral adaptations to block the flow of that sticky latex sap so that it can eat milkweed leaves without gluing their mouth parts together. Most insects can't do that, and that's why there's not all that many things that eat milkweed. And remember, 90% of the insects out there are specialists, just like the monarch butterfly. The monarch is not an exception. It is the rule. We have to think about pollinators. Now, the country's been pretty good talking about pollinators. There are, pollinator pathways and pollinator projects all over the country. But we're a little confused about why we need pollinators. We need them everywhere, not just in agriculture. The media will tell you need pollinators because they pollinate a third of your crops. It is much bigger than that, folks. They pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants, including a few of our crops. And by the way, May Berenbaum, the University of Illinois, has looked at that figure, and she says it's really closer to not 30%, but 12% of our crops depend on pollinators. And I hear people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need to support pollinators. Yes, you do. We need pollinators every place. We need plants, which is every place. We have to start to appreciate the ecological value of leaves, of leaf litter. The leaves that fall from our trees each year contain the nutrients that tree used that year, and those nutrients have to go back into the soil so the tree can use them again. If we rake our leaves away every single year, we're raking away the nutrients that fuel growth in our plants. And if you do that for 50 years, no wonder our trees don't live as long as they ought to. Leaves are also forming the perfect blanket over our soil to maintain soil moisture. And boy, in your temperatures of 110, you need that more than anything. You need that thick leaf layer to protect the soil as much as possible. Keep those temperatures out of there, because all of the things that live in soil depend on high humidity. And that includes the mycorrhizal fungal associations that transfer nutrients to roots, all of the tiny little things that are detritivores. They break down the leaves, return the nutrients to the soil. So the soil community is really important, and leaf litter is the guardian of that soil community. People worry, I can't keep the leaves on my yard. I can't keep them in my beds because my plants won't grow through them. Yes, they will. Now, they're not going to grow through 5 feet of leaves, but normal layer of leaf litter is not a barrier at all. Think about it. Who was raking the leaves before we got here? Nobody was, and the plants seem to do all right. So there's zillions of ground covers that go right through those leaves without a problem. Light pollution, major cause of insect declines, and we need to think about how to fix that. It turns out, you can turn your lights out, you can put a motion sensor on it, but the easiest thing to do is to replace the white bulb in our outdoor lights with yellow bulbs, because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects. You can now go to the hardware store. You can buy these things. It's not a big deal. If we were to switch out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if we use LEDs, we'd save millions of dollars as well. Mosquito fogging. This is a booming business around the country. It's killing all of our insects. Another major cause of insect decline. Now these, the mosquito foggers say it's okay because what they're fogging is a natural product. And it is a natural product. It's pyrethroids from chrysanthemums. That's the insecticide in chrysanthemums that keeps insects from eating those plants. It's industrial strength pyrethroids. But, cyanide is a natural product. Ricin is a natural product. There's a lot of nasty natural products that nature makes. So I'm not sure that's a good argument. They also say it only kills mosquitoes. Not even close to being true. It kills all of the insects it comes in contact with, which is all of the insects, all of the pollinators, monarchs. This is after a mosquito fogging event in the eastern shore of Maryland. And I know you've had big monarch deaths in Texas from mosquito foggers. So it is not benign. The interesting thing is it doesn't control mosquitoes. You have to kill 90% of adult mosquitoes if you're going to actually get control. And these guys kill between 10 and 50%. So they're not even close to being effective. If you really want to kill mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay, put it out in the sun for a couple of days and let it kind of ferments. It builds up populations of diatoms and algae. And that is what mosquito larvae eat. And that is what attracts female mosquitoes that want to lay their eggs. So this bucket you've created will become an irresistible brew to the female mosquitoes in your yard. They will lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you get a sheet of mosquito dunks, $12, and you put a dunk in your bucket. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. It is a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera, and the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larva. Targeted. If a dragonfly gets in here, it doesn't hurt it a bit. If your dog drinks it, no problem. You might put a coarse screen over it so the local chipmunk doesn't jump in. But this is targeted, it's cheap, and if everybody did it, it actually would control mosquitoes. We don't want to give up on small properties. 82% of us live in cities, and a lot of us have really small properties. But we're learning from people like Pam Carlson in Chicago how effective a tiny property can do. She has 1/10 of an acre, and she's not connected to any natural area at all. 1/10 of an acre, by the way, is 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's recorded 124 bird species on her property. And if you don't have any property at all, container gardening. We're learning how to do this with native plants. So if you live in an apartment complex, put it on your balcony. Not one, put a bunch of them on there. And all of a sudden it becomes a resource for a lot of native bees and those migrating monarchs. So lots of options, and it can be really beautiful as well. Now, fortunately, we do have a silver bullet in our fight against climate change and the biodiversity crisis, and that is that conservation works. Nature is really resilient. And I'm going to give you just a few examples. This is the Nachusa grasslands in Illinois, 3,800 acres. There are now more than 730 native plant species, and 180 species of birds have been recorded here. It used to be a cornfield. Resilience. Nature is resilience. This is my house, our house, right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. It's what it looked like when we moved in the year 2000. Cindy and I bought 10 acres of this farm that was broken up, had been mowed for hay, been farmed for almost 300 years, not much there. So our goal was to restore life on this property. Of course, when you mow for hay in the east, what you're really mowing are the rootstocks or all the invasive plants. So when you stop mowing to build the house, that's what the property looks like. We had 10 acres of impenetrable vines and multiflora rose, all the thorny things from Asia. And that was step one. We had to get rid of that stuff. And when I say we, I mean Cindy. It is a huge job. There is no doubt about it. And a lot of people are tempted to just give up. And I don't blame you. But Cindy has shown that it is totally doable. You just kind of start at one end and you just keep going. So she has gotten rid of the, certainly the major invasives. Now, a lot of them keep coming back each year from seed stock, but then they're much easier to control. So this is what the property looks like today. We put a lot of the plants back, or they've come back naturally. This is called addition by subtraction. You simply take out the things you don't want, and the good plants will come in on their own with the blue jays and the squirrels and the wind and the water. Well, my research has shown that if you know the number of moth species in your local food web, you have a good index of how productive that food web is and how stable it is. So 6 years ago, I started to count all the moths that are now making a living at my house. I am still at it. I added another one last night, but I'm now up to 1,224 species of moths. Just moths, haven't gotten to the butterflies yet, that are residents of our property because we put those plants back. And they're interesting creatures, things like the chinkapin leaf miner, the skullcap skeletonizer, the neighbor, they've got great names, the little devil, the horrid zale, the forgotten frigid owlet. Not a very pretty moth, but it's got a great name. The scallop sallow, the obtuse yellow, the explicit archid, and yes, there is an implicit arches as well. The snowy shouldered aclaris, the grateful midget, the morbid owlet, the pink shaded fern moth, the feeble grass moth, the scribbler, the lemon plagotis, the showy emerald, the green marvel, Harris's three spot, the old wife underwing, eyed pectes, the tufted bird dropping moth. Who wouldn't want the tufted bird dropping moth? And this is my favorite, the spun glass caterpillar. just an exquisite example of what natural selection can produce. And hundreds of other species have come back because we put the plants that support those things. And the first question people ask me is, well, if you've got all these moths there, they're going to defoliate your property. Well, they would if we had nothing eating those caterpillars, but we got a lot of things eating those caterpillars, including birds. We have recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our property, and they eat hundreds of caterpillars every single day. And we've got other predators. We've got ambush bugs. We've got assassin bugs. We've got predatory stink bugs. This guy sat next to this aggregation of the milkweed tussock moth and ate one a day. Then there were far fewer. We got a lot of parasitoids out there, Hymenoptera, wasps that lay their eggs in caterpillars. Got hundreds of those species. And we've got other wasps that sting the caterpillars, paralyze them, then fly off and put them in their nest, and then they lay an egg on it. This is nature's refrigerator. The caterpillar is alive, so it's not going to shrivel up and rot. If they actually killed the caterpillar and laid an egg on it, it would be rotted before the egg even hatched. And we got other things that eat insects, like our skunks and our possums and our raccoons and our foxes. 25% of a fox's diet is insects. We've got tree frogs, we've got toads, we've got salamanders, we've got ring-necked snakes. These guys are all insect eaters, and the cutest little gray tree frogs, which happen to be green when they're young on the property. Of course, many other things as well. Okay, we've talked a lot about lawn, but you know what? Lawn it's too modest a goal because not enough of the land is in lawn. Most of our privately owned land is in small woodlots, it's in cropland, or it's in rangeland. Small woodlots, over 406 million acres of woodlots managed by private citizens, not logging companies in the U.S. An enormous amount of land. And how they manage them, and by manage them, I mean they're logging them. But how you log it and whether or not you're controlling the invasive plants in these woodlots is going to determine their biodiversity value. There are organizations like the Foundation for Sustainable Forests in Western Pennsylvania that have figured out you really can manage a forest forever if you harvest it in the right way. There are two ways to harvest forests: high-grade harvesting, where you take the best trees and leave the rest, and worst first, where you take the worst trees and leave the best trees. High-grade foresting gives you a good harvest once. Then you got to wait at least 80 years before you do it again. Worst first, with smaller, more frequent harvests, lead to higher yields over time indefinitely because you're not taking the heart of the forest. But the invasive load in our natural areas, in those forested areas, is tremendous. Up to a third of the biomass is now invasive plants from Asia. And one of the important things that's exacerbating this invasive species load is the overabundance of deer in so many places of the country, because the deer eat the natives and they don't eat the invasive plants. They push the competitive value, the competitive edge against our native plants. So we have to manage the deer, folks. We cannot have too many deer and expect our native plants to be able to compete. Here's a deer exclosure showing that get mayapple and actual understory. This is what it looks like outside where you're not managing the deer. And if you do this for an entire generation of trees, we're going to have no forests left. The deer are also exacerbating stiltgrass, which is a terrible problem at my house, Asian jumping worms. This is the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I visited it in May of this year. And the first thing I noticed is they've got great understory. I hadn't seen great understory in a long time. So I asked the people down there, well, how come you've got understory? Who is managing your deer? And they say, we don't manage our deer at all. I said, well, how come they haven't eaten everything? And they're not managing their deer, but they've got black bear. They're a good population of black bear. They've got coyotes, they've got bobcats, and they are managing the deer. So it's not wolves, it's not all the predators, but they have enough predators to keep the deer in check, and it works just the way it used to work. Another serious downside of deer overabundance, of course, is Lyme disease. I've had Lyme disease 5 times. It is a serious issue because we have too many deer. So how are we going to control our deer? Well, you can put the predators back. That'd be great. Sharpshooters are always suggested, and they're expensive. They'll come into a neighborhood, they'll shoot. Maybe they shoot half the deer, but it's never enough, and they leave, and the deer bounce right back. Bern Blasi at Cornell is suggesting market hunting. That's what we used to do at the turn of the century. That's what controlled those pesky bison. That's what got rid of the passenger pigeon. You get paid for what you shoot, and it could control our deer. If you got to change some rules for that to happen. In the meantime, you got to put cages around the plants you want to keep. That's how I got the oaks on my property. I had to protect every single one. Okay, cropland. Got a lot of area in cropland. All the green here is cropland. That's another 410 million acres in cropland. Now, we're not going to get rid of cropland, but there's several things we can do in our agricultural areas that will boost biodiversity. We can manage the roadsides. We can put hedgerows back every place we have the opportunity to. We can add prairie strips, and we can limit our use of neonicotinoid insecticides. The monarch is now red listed. It is we've lost 96% of them. A terrible year. I've seen one monarch this year, and I drove all the way across the country and back. So terrible year for monarchs. Why? Because we turned most of the area that they bred in into lawn. The areas next to all of our agriculture throughout the Midwest and the East as well used to be, essentially prairie systems, and then they were converted into grass. It had to be mowed. So, terrible for climate change, terrible for biodiversity, not just for the monarch, because there were weeds. That's the milkweed, that's the goldenrod, the asters, the evening primrose, all the things that supported our native bees were eliminated as well. But again, we can put it back, and people are doing that. They're doing that in Iowa, and I know they're doing it in places in Texas. There's just no reason why we need that lawn there. That's simply an aesthetic that has devastated biodiversity throughout much of the country. Add hedgerows any chance we get, and make sure they are native plants, diverse native plants. What happens when we allow non-natives to invade the hedgerows we have? This is autumn olive and multiflora rose and lots of other things around here. I took an undergrad a couple of years ago, and we measured caterpillar density and diversity in hedgerows that were invaded and hedgerows that were not invaded in Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. And all right, here's an uninvaded hedgerow. That was the trick, finding uninvaded hedgerows. There was a 68% reduction of the caterpillar species in the invaded hedgerows, a 91% reduction in the abundance of those caterpillars, and a 96% reduction in the biomass, the actual weight, the amount of energy that's available for the birds out there. In other words, we have removed 96% of the bird food when we allow our hedgerows to become invaded with non-native plants. Prairie strips, wonderful idea. You put a prairie strip of blooming native plants right in the middle of the soybean fields and the corn fields. You put it perpendicular to the flow of water off the landscape. Not only does it help the pollinators, of course, but it also reduces topsoil loss by 95%, reduces water pollution by 90%, because all that stuff is intercepted in these prairie strips, and they're supported by USDA CREP programs. This is just a no-brainer. Every grower has to add a prairie strip. We've got to avoid neonicotinoids, particularly neonicotinoid seed coatings that aren't even counted as insecticides. They are 7,000 times more toxic to insects than DDT was. They're used preventively. In other words, whether or not you have an insect problem, you use it. And what's interesting is, if you compare yield where you use neonics on seed coating and where you don't use them, there's no increase in yield. So we're doing this for nothing. Only 5% of the product is taken up by the plants. The other 95% is washed off into the watershed or blows away on dust, where we have no idea what's going on. I do know that in many places where it has been measured in this country, there are neonicotinoids in the rain coming down. So it's hitting everything, and you wonder why our insects are disappearing. Let's try to avoid this. We're doing it for nothing. Finally, rangeland, 770 million acres of rangeland, 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. But it doesn't have to be a disaster. It depends on how many cattle you run. This is an experimental range in Nebraska that Cindy and I visited. These are all sunflowers. This was a productive place. All the prairie birds were there. Remember, all of our grasslands were historically grazed. They were grazed by bison. They were grazed by large mammals for for millions of years, literally. So having grazers on grassland is that's actually a necessary thing. But we can improve what's happening on our rangeland, particularly in the West, by avoiding overgrazing, by putting the beavers back, believe it or not, and by keeping the cows out of the stream. Beavers. We had beavers everywhere, but we trapped them out. And when you trap them out, you remove the beaver dams. That slows the flow of water off the land, and you get channeling, you get incising of the stream, which lowers the water table. And in the arid West, that creates desertification, essentially. It destroys the productivity of that land simply by taking the beavers out. So put the beavers back, get that water table back up, and keep the cows out of those wetlands that you create, because they eat the cottonwood and they eat the willows. They eat all of the native vegetation on the side of those streams, and that's where most of the biodiversity resides. Those are all doable things, by the way. Now, there's something common to each one of these conservation practices, and that is that whether or not they succeed depends on the decisions that you and I make. I had a student 2 years ago who was writing on a final exam. One of the things she said was, while conservationists claim to be managing species and habitats, what we're really managing is people. And that is so true. These are sociological issues. It's the decisions that people make. We're talking about changing our culture from an adversarial approach, an adversarial relationship with nature, to a collaborative one. And the real question is, can we do this? Well, I certainly believe that we can do it. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. People everywhere, they're concerned about the loss of birds and insects and all these other things, but they all feel powerless. What can one person do? One person can do a lot of things. They can shrink the lawn. They can modify their lights. They can add a pollinator garden. They can remove invasive plants. They can put in keystone plants. They can fire their mosquito fogger. They can join Homegrown National Park. All kinds of things a single person can do that will totally reinvigorate the productivity of the ecosystem on their property, and then enhance their local ecosystem rather than degrading it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the planet that you can control. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They'll love you as a volunteer. So we hope that Homegrown National Park will provide the motivation and the guidance for millions and millions and millions of people to tackle these conservation challenges. And how we act now, whether or not we do this, is going to determine nature's fate and then eventually our own. So please get on the map. Thank you very much.
So let's see, going back, one of the first questions that we had was, if planting native grasses as a lawn, is that considered a lawn, or is that considered helping biodiversity?
That's a good question. The way we treat our lawns is that we mow them so that we can keep them short and walk on them. And of course, if you mow something, whether it's a native plant or not, you're killing everything that was associated with that plant. So if you're really going to treat it as a lawn, whether you switch to native plants or not isn't going to make a big difference. This is why I say, we reduce the area we have in lawn, and the lawn we keep will be manicured. It's a cue for care. It shows that our neighbors, that we understand what the culture is, and we're all for it. We're just going to have less lawn. And the other areas are going to be the areas where that biodiversity is going to reside. So if we actually treat it as a lawn, it will never be the source of our biodiversity.
Okay. Thank you. And then on the light bulbs, you mentioned using the yellow light bulbs. Can you add something around that light fixture that's yellow and achieve the same thing rather than purchasing yellow bulbs?
You would think you can, but tests suggest no. it's the wavelength of the light that's produced. And I guess whether a yellow cellophane changes the wavelength, I can't explain the physics of it, because I would think, yes, that would work too. But people have actually tested that, and apparently the wavelengths are not changed enough, even though the color of the light is apparently so. But it's easy, any hardware store sells these things now, both as LED or incandescent lights. So it would be easier to buy a new bulb than to try to wrap it with something that's going to change the color, in my opinion.
Okay. The next comment question is, I'm trying to rewild and bring natives back to my yard, but having a tremendous problem with midges. How do you control them while trying to bring back their predators?
Well, midges, if you're really talking about midges, that's the family Chironomidae. They're aquatic. They are coming from your aquatic system. They have nothing to do with your plants, whether they're native or not. So there's not a connection there with the plants you're choosing. So it doesn't, yeah, your midges are coming from, if you have a little pond, or if you have a marsh or a wet area, that's where they're coming from.
Okay. Another comment question is, can we contact like the U.S. Department of Transportation to require or give additional funding to use natives on the roadside as they're funding new highway projects?
Right. You've got the Ladybird Wildflower Center down there that's been working on that for, I don't know, 60 years now. So how you go about doing that, I would contact them and say, what do we need to know about Texas rules to change more of these roadways? Because people are doing it in different places. So you've got a great resource down there with the Ladybird Wildflower Center. So.
And then question on sharing the slide deck in PDF, if you're willing to do that.
Well, the whole thing was taped, so you have total access to it. But if you actually want the slides, I can send you the slides, but there's no voice associated with it. But if you want that, send me an email, and yeah, I do that pretty often.
And then lots of positive comments, and I guess, we've got someone, Alicia Garlock has a question, so I'm going to see if I can unmute her. It may take me a second to figure this out. It feels... Alicia, can you?
Is it me? Sorry.
Yes. Okay, you can do it. I just wasn't sure if I had you locked. So
Okay.
thank
Well,
you.
I wanted to say hello because him and I have been conversing for over a year now, maybe going on 2 years. It's been a while, but Mr. Douglas Tallamy helped me with a lot of presentations on oaks here down in San Antonio. And I wanted to say hello and thank you so much for all your work and dedication and helping others to understand the nature of oaks. And then this project, which I actually included in my book that I emailed you about, but also to share it with people here in San Antonio and see how we can just spread the word on this program, because, we do need to start working to protect our future, the biodiversity, the insects that we need to survive. And this is a great program that you have there, and whatever we can do to share it, I guess you can let us know. I mean, I went and signed up already, but if we can share it from the Native Plant Society, right? They can share the information and everything,
right.
And try to get it into our city people, our council people, and our city governments. We are in contact with the city of Austin also. So that would be a great idea, just to spread awareness on that. And thank you for all your work. I appreciate you.
I appreciate your support. And by the way, I'll be happy to send you those 4 pictures you asked for.
So our next comment question is, I live outside of Texas. I started an 1,100 square foot pocket prairie in the fall. Drought and 105 degrees for 5 weeks. It is now fried. What do you suggest? Mow in fall or late winter?
Yeah, I think the real prairie makers, the real meadow makers will seed in the fall or very early spring, depending on where you live. You've had some terrible weather. I just hope it's not that way the rest of our lives. But once those plants are established, and once those, prairie plants have very deep root systems, they reach way down where it's cooler and where there's water, and they're very good at withstanding rough weather, but not when they're an inch high. So it's getting them established, and I would say you just have to keep trying and hope you get some decent weather till you get those root systems down. But you don't want to plant late spring or early fall where it's still going to be really, really hot, because that can be devastating.
Okay, and then next is, how do we let native grasses grow without increasing fire risks?
Well, it's another issue. The Maui fires were either started or encouraged by an invasive grass, which is green for a while and then turns tinder brown. Cheatgrass in the West actually starts most of the fires that we have. Then they run into the forest. So really dry grass is a burn risk. And one thing, depending on where you live, the live oaks, any of the live oaks you have actually can act like pretty good fire breaks where they intercept flying embers. A lot of people want to get rid of not just the grass, but all the trees too, because they're fire risk. Not so for oaks. They're very good fire prevention. I don't have a good answer for that. Bare soil is just deadly, but so are forest fires. So,
well, and my husband does prescribe burns as his career.
Yeah.
So having, where you're managing and you're keeping so that you don't maintain too much litter on the ground when you can do prescribed burns is definitely an option. And they've been burning at the Botanical Research Institute, Texas, that's downtown Fort Worth. They did a little pocket prairie burn
that
last
is a
fall. So
wonderful suggestion. Yeah.
What would you recommend to remove our turf grasses? Here in Texas, we have a lot of tough grasses like Bermuda, and it's hard to kill them off.
Yeah. It depends on how much area you're trying to remove them from. If it's a reasonable amount, you can, they have something called builder's cloth. It's almost like a pliable cardboard. And you buy it and you roll it out. So when you often see it in new construction, people put it on the floors and things, but it's thick enough that you would roll it out over the grass and you'd weighting it down with mulch is the best. And you got to kill that grass. So it takes a while. Months, you're talking about months where it's covered up, protected from any of the sun. Sun encourages growth and photosynthesis. The object is to kill the roots. If you're talking about a large area, the professionals spray. They can't wait months or years trying to kill the grass. So they spray with an herbicide and then they proceed from that. I'll just say a word about herbicides. It's a tool. It's an effective tool if it's used properly. I liken it to chemotherapy. If you have a tumor in your body, we use chemotherapy. That's a toxin. We can use too much, we kill ourselves with it. So you got to do it correctly. But without chemotherapy, there's a huge issue. And I don't know how we control a lot of our invasives or remove grass or something in a timely manner without using herbicides. And I know that's controversial, and I know there are people who get really mad at me for saying that, but we're not going to live forever. It takes forever to do it otherwise. So
understand. Just to clarify on regarding native grasses, if left unmowed, would they be considered an overall positive?
Native grasses?
Yes.
Sure. Absolutely. You know, all of our skippers are on, well, most of our skippers are on native grasses. And it's not just caterpillars that are important. The grasshoppers, the orthopterans that are the second most important amount of bird food and animal food out there depend largely on those native worm season clump grasses. So, and they're holding the soil. They all have very deep root systems. They're not very big biomass wise, but they are pumping a lot of carbon into the ground through those root systems. So measures of carbon sequestration in prairie systems are almost as high as mature forests, believe it or not, because of the ability of those deep roots to pump that carbon into the ground. So they're extremely valuable if you do want to get them out there if you can.
How do we convince city officials to stop spraying for mosquitoes every time positive West Nile reading shows up in our neighborhood creeks?
You got to look at the facts. Mosquito spraying does not control the mosquito population. It does kill everything else. Show them the picture of the dead monarchs. Tell them if they keep doing it, we're going to vote them out. I mean, you got it. This is where science has to take over, not emotions. Look at the actual risk of West Nile versus the risk of ecosystem collapse. I know West Nile's an issue, but it's a tiny issue compared to deaths from cell phones or the other things that we don't care about at all. So it's an overreaction that I wish we could get control of.
And our person that mentioned the 105, she just wanted to clarify, she lives outside of Austin, not outside of Texas. So we'll clarify on that. And then one comment or question is she took a couple of screenshots of your slides or your presentation. Is it okay for her to share via Facebook Garden Club her screenshots?
Sure. You know, if I could give this to everybody in the planet once, I would do it. The object is to get this information out. So if you can help me do that, that's great.
Then what resources are available at the website? Any templates or hints for dealing with city weed ordinances?
Wild Ones. You have Wild Ones chapters in Texas, I think. They have available a whole list of different ordinances that people could just use and share. So I would contact somebody in Wild Ones and say, where do I get that? Where do I get that list of ordinances? Because they've done the work, and that's very helpful.
And then we've got a comment that we've got the native landscape certification program. So many of those questions can be answered by taking those courses that we have for Texas through our Native Plant Society of Texas. Best way to find out what plants, trees are native for your area. I posted earlier the National Wildlife Federation link, as well as our Native Plant Society chapter website. Should have some stuff, and we're working on some revisions to websites. So as soon as we get those up, we'll have a better list. But most of the areas do. And then there's also a nice page on the Native Plant Society of Texas website. We have many oaks, but we are struggling with vines choking them out. Is there a good control method for the vines?
It depends on what the vines are. Native vines like Virginia creeper or poison ivy do climb the trees, but they don't pull them down. They don't girdle them. It's a much nicer relationship. Oriental bittersweet, porcelain berry, the non-native vines do girdle the plants. They do weight them down and pull them down. Now, native grapes, they can get pretty heavy. They can be an issue too, but it's a really good plant too. So I compromise there. I cut it off at the base every once in a while, maybe every 2 or 3 years. It'll grow vigorously and come up, but it supports a whole lot of things. But if it gets heavy on the tree, you want to just cut it off. Oriental bittersweet, you got to cut it off, and then to kill that root system, you've got to treat it with herbicides. I have been trying to do it otherwise for 20 years. It just doesn't work. It's got a massive root system. Porcelain berry, at least east of you guys, is the kudzu of our area. I mean, it is terrible. And it looks a lot like grape, but you definitely don't want that to get going, because that will climb up over everything. And yes, it'll smother them all. So kind of an individual basis, but if this is where managing your private property becomes doable. If you're talking about getting rid of all the vines of Texas, that's a big job. But your piece of the world, you can pick at it. You can get them under control. But some of those vines are really, really important. Virginia creeper is a really great plant. Poison ivy, believe it or not, supports an awful lot of life. So only control it where you absolutely need to.
Okay. What time of year is it okay to rake leaves?
Well, if you're trying to keep the leaves off your lawn, and the part of the lawn you're going to keep, you do want to keep the leaves off of it. Rake them right when they fall, and move them to an area where you're going to keep them. You should treat leaves the way you treat water. You want all the water that falls on your property to stay on your property. You also want all the leaves that fall on your property to stay on your property, because remember, they contain the nutrients that your trees needed. So you're going to rake them around your property, but not leave them. We're not going to put them out to the curb as if they were trash. So the time to do that is right when they fall, because a lot of things become associated with them after they're on the ground.
Thank you. Lots of thanks for presentations and great job in those. Any idea if there are places across North America that incentivize native plants versus traditional lawns with tax breaks, design services, seed or plant giveaways, etc.? Communities that put their money towards the ethos of HNP.
Yes, there are a growing number. First of all, there's more and more states that are banning the sale of invasive plants. So that incentivizes non-invasive plants for sure. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program that is encouraging people to replace some or all of their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. That's one of the oldest programs. Pennsylvania has a similar program, much younger, but it's very popular. There's a waiting list right away. There are utilities, and some of these are in Texas, that are giving people $100 coupons to plant native plants that are water efficient versus the non-native plants that aren't. California, of course, has the big lawn reduction programs. You get $3 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn you remove and replace with xeric plantings. So these programs are popping up. St. Louis, Fayetteville, Arkansas, North Carolina have a bounty on calorie pair. If you take a calorie pair out, you get a free tree replacement. If you don't have an incentive like this where you live, maybe you can get one going.
Well, and I'm just thinking on xeric, are they allowing swap out for turf, like artificial turf? Is that allowed under that?
I don't know, but that would not be accomplishing the goal.
I agree. That'd be just cautious. It's just a comment. Please share your information with the tree person at Keep America Beautiful. They have some influence with state and local affiliates all around the country, and you may already be involved with them.
I just talked to the head of Keep America Beautiful. So he's very much on board. He used to run Keep Indianapolis Beautiful, and now he's doing the whole national thing. So he's on board. It's a great program.
And so our person with her fried prairie said, should she mow it all down and see what comes back next spring? Or way you recommend?
If it's not in the front yard, I wouldn't even bother to mow it. That's organic matter that, can add important organics to the soil as it breaks down. If it's pocket prairie right in front of the front door, yeah, maybe you want to mow it. But
Is there any advantage?
Well, it could be that a lot of the rootstocks are not dead and they will come back. So yeah, don't assume they're all dead.
So my follow-up question is, as far as I know, some of those stems are also houses for beneficial insects. When is it okay to go and trim out the previous year's growth?
Well, there's a lot of native bees that nest in the pithy stems of our prairie plants, but they nest in those stems the following summer. So there's no appropriate time to take them out, because the following summer, that's when the nests will be there. The new plants grow up past them, so you don't see the dead material anymore. But it will, and then the following winter, those guys overwinter. So it's actually a 2-year cycle. So what Heather Holmes suggests is that you can cut them back, but do it maybe leaving at least a foot, but maybe 18 inches from the ground. So it removes the tall stuff that's unsightly, but that lower part is where the bees are going to nest. And if you can keep that around, it'll help the nesting bees a lot.
Okay, thank you. Should a restoration project focus on keystone plants or planting a large diversity of native plants, species, and types of plants?
You should do your best to compromise with that. I can plant a 100% native landscape, and if it doesn't have keystone plants in it, it probably will be a failed food web. So you got to have some of those keystone plants in there. But diversity is really good too, particularly when you're talking about pollinators, and particularly when you're talking about meadow plants or prairie plants. The most productive landscape of all is the oak savanna, where you've got an oak here and an oak there, but then you've got prairie in between. So you got the best of both worlds. If you can achieve that, that would be great.
Okay, next question is, can BT be used at scale, like to control mosquito populations in all of the ponds?
When you have standing water, so it never dries up, that's not where your mosquitoes are coming from, because then you also have mosquito predators that are in there. Everything eats mosquito larvae when it doesn't dry up. It's temporary bodies of water where the water's laying there for a week or so. That generates a lot of mosquitoes. Another place that generates mosquitoes that people don't think about is your sewer system. If you're in a city, there's often an inch of water laying at the bottom of the sewer drains. So can it be used to scale? Yes. Throw a mosquito junk down in each one of those drains, but don't start throwing it all in your lakes, because that's not where your mosquitoes are coming from. And there are other aquatic diptera that you don't want to be killing.
We're slowly working through this list. So what about saw greenbrier?
People don't like it, but nature does. It's a great native plant. A lot of caterpillars eat it. It's another deer like it too. So if you don't want to starve all of your deer and you want them to eat something other than your pretty plants, keep some of that around because they love it.
What is the best way to eliminate a yard full of English ivy?
Oh boy. Anytime that you can. It's a tough one because it roots pretty much everywhere where the vine is on the ground, but it's terrible invasive. The leaves are really waxy. So if you say, I am going to use an herbicide, you've got to use a lot of surfactant because it just runs right off. If it's flat and it's an area you can actually mow, and you can mow it repeatedly, that helps a lot. That'll knock it down. But it's definitely one of your tougher invasives to remove. You don't have to wait for special weather or time of year. Anytime you want to get out there, start hacking at it.
And then my neighbor planted bamboo, which pops up on our property. I cut back when I find them any way to remove them without damaging any of the trees and plants on my property.
This is why bamboo is banned in Dover, Delaware. It'll grow right up through your driveway. It'll grow right up through the floorboards of your house. There's records of that. I don't know why. I'm not a litigious guy, but your neighbor does not have the right to spoil your own landscape. And if you have a working relationship with them, saying, please get rid of this. I have seen entire yards destroyed by bamboo where they have to get a backhoe in and essentially remove the entire yard and then start from scratch with new fill. That is such a terrible plant. It will keep coming in your yard forever and keep moving farther and farther in. You can paint each bamboo stalk there with herbicide, and that'll slow it down. But terrible, terrible problem. People who sell bamboo should not be allowed to sell bamboo. I mean, personal opinion.
Understand. And then who is Heather Holmes, and is she a prairie expert?
She lives in Minnesota, and she is a native bee expert, and is especially on the prairie plants in the upper Midwest. But yeah, she's a national figure. She's got several books out. HOLM. Look them up on Amazon. And if you're talking about getting important native bee information to the public, Heather is the way to go. Nobody's doing it better.
And then if you want to plant keystone species, would you say it is more effective to plant based on the insects, birds already present in your area, or plant what may attract species you may not have seen?
That's a great question. I've never gotten that question before. You want to stick with the plants that belong there. So that would be your guide. What is recorded as growing in my eco region in my county? You don't want to, range outside of that. But as you increase the diversity of those plants, you will bring in insects you've never seen before. I am still doing that at my house, as you know. I grew up eastern deciduous forest. I've always been here, and every time I look, I see something I haven't seen. So, and your diversity in Texas is much higher. So you definitely will bring in things you haven't seen by increasing the amount and the diversity of the plants in your yard.
We had a presentation earlier this year for our chapter on the ecological site descriptions that USDA has put together through, I think it's housed at New Mexico State, but it covers the US but it's primarily range plants. Is there another location of maybe more of the flora, fauna that might not have been so supportive of, their purpose wasn't necessarily feeding animals?
If you want to know the distribution of every plant species in the country, there's a website. It's called BONAP, BONAP. It's an acronym. Biota, America, doesn't matter. Just put in BONAP and it will pop up. And then it has all of the letters of the alphabet there. So if you're looking for a genus that starts with A, you click on A, and then all of the genera that start with A are there. And then you click on the genus you want, and it'll give you a range map for every species in that genus. And it's the most accurate range maps in the country. And you'll be able to say, does this plant occur naturally in my county? So it's much better than the USDA range maps. As a matter of fact, the guy who created BONAP created the USDA ones, but he had a falling out with them, and he and they're not as accurate. So he went out and started his own. So that would be what I would go to. And then you would know what belongs where.
Okay. I've struggled with the bone apps personally because it'll show like it stops at the county line.
It's
And
all
I know that the soils in that eco-region keeps going across those county lines. So that's just
but it's a county where there's a record of that plant. So that's what that means.
Then let me see. Sorry, I'm trying to wade through just the Nature's Best Hope was brilliant, and I appreciate this presentation very much. I hope to be able to share it with those who don't have time to read the book. We'll definitely add our small landscape to the HNP. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
And then I think I've pretty well covered all of the questions so far. If anyone else has, we got, I think, a minute left. If you have another question, if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you and ask. Tricia, do you want to say anything?
Yes, so thank you very much for joining us. It was very inspiring. And I'm curious about what's in the jar behind you.
I've been looking at that too. Napkins are in that jar. Now, why do I have napkins in that jar? I raise a lot of caterpillars, and at the bottom of each little caterpillar container, you have to put a fresh napkin, and you dampen it. So wherever I go, I collect napkins. And I'm surprised that jar is there. I'm sorry, but
just curious.
I go through a lot of that.
Well, it was very inspiring. And I think what we're doing in all of this is we're actually, it's a lot more trendy to say that we're protecting pollinators, but really what we're trying to do is protect insects and promote insects. And insects are the ones that are going to save the world, but insects are just not going to be a big popular draw for people. But that's really kind of what we're doing.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we've got this war against insects. We're winning. We've lost 45% of the insects on the planet already. So we just keep trying to educate. We need insects, and I'm sorry if you don't like them. That's why I show pretty pictures. They're not so bad.
And moths especially, that's a harder sell than the butterfly.
It is, yeah.
But we need them.
Yes. Well, thanks for realizing that.
All right. Well, thank you for being their cheerleader.
All right.
And I love the quote that the conservation related to we're impacting people and we're changing people's behavior, I think is so critical. So really appreciate you. Thank you. A huge round of applause.